Ending homelessness in the U.S. by 2020 will require us to make significant improvements in the way our homelessness systems function. The department has developed a set of 7 system-level measures to help communities understand their system's performance. This video features measure 2 of the 7 and explains why the measure is important, how it's calculated, and then how you might consider using the measure locally. So the goal for this measure is pretty simple. We'd like to see people exit your system and not return. Obviously, this concept is key to reducing overall homelessness. So the question is, what percentage of people who move to permanent housing after being homeless end up experiencing homelessness again within the next 6, 12, and 24 months? So we're looking for reductions in that percentage from one year to the next. We start by looking at returns within 6 and 12 months. And then later, we add in returns within the following year, or the 12 to 24 month period. And we do this to be practical. We don't want to wait 2 years to get the data on 6 and 12 months, and we want to encourage you to look at your returns data as soon as you can. So for each time period, at 6 months, 12 months, and 24 months, we look at the system in 2 ways. First, we're looking at people who exited homeless projects for permanent housing. Of those people, we want to know who returned to a shelter, safe haven, or transitional housing after the exit to a permanent housing destination. Then we add in instances when they return to homeless projects, including permanent housing projects that are part of the Continuum system and have homelessness as an eligibility criterion. In this latter case, even though a person's moving into a permanent housing project, we assume the person must have returned to homelessness if they're entering a program that requires homelessness to get in. So we want to count that person as returning to homelessness. To be very clear, this does not include transfers from one permanent housing project to another, nor does it include situations where a person has a very short break between exiting homeless projects and entering a permanent housing project. HUD understands that the timing of a placement into permanent housing isn't always perfect, so we've accounted for that. And programming specifications will make sure that these types of transfers are not counted as returns to homelessness. Okay, so let's look at a simple scenario. Bob is living in an emergency shelter. He exits that shelter and moves into an apartment that he rents. This is considered an exit to a permanent housing destination. Now let's look at more homeless assistance projects. We have an emergency shelter, a safe haven, a transitional housing project, and a permanent supportive housing project. And there are people in all of those projects. All of the time, some of those people are moving to permanent housing destinations. These could be unassisted rental housing, permanent supportive housing, living with friends and family in a stable situation, public or assisted housing, or permanent housing with rapid rehousing assistance. So here we see 10 people who have exited to a permanent housing destination. Now we want to know how many of those 10 who exited returned to homelessness over the next 2 years. Let's say 2 of those people return to a project that helps people who are homeless. Emergency shelter, transitional housing, rapid rehousing, or even permanent supportive housing. If 2 of our 10 have returned to homelessness, that's a 20% return to homelessness rate. So that's the basic concept. Now let's talk about how the timing works. We'll be looking at people who exit for a permanent housing destination in the previous year. Even if somebody has 2 exits to a permanent housing destination during that year, we'll be looking at the first one. So let's say that Bob exited to his rental housing in March. We're going to be looking at 3 different time periods to see if he returns: 6, 12, and 24 months after his exit from shelter to rental housing. So let's say he returns to a shelter in August, 5 months after he exited to rental housing. That counts as a return to homelessness within the 6-month period. Now let's look at another example, Barbara. She exits a transitional housing project to a permanent housing destination in April, and then she has a return to homelessness in June of the following year, which is 14 months later. So she would be counted as returning to homelessness within the 24-month measure. All right, now let's add 8 more individuals. All of these people exit homelessness to a permanent housing destination in July and don't enter another homeless project for at least 24 months. If we tally up returns, our overall outcomes will be that 1 out of 10, or 10%, of people return to homelessness within 6 months. None of the 10 returned in the 6 to 12 month period. and 1 out of the 10, or 10%, returned to homelessness between 12 and 24 months. That means that a total of 2 out of 10, or 20% of the cohort, returned to homelessness within 2 years. So now that you understand how this measure is calculated, let's talk about how you can use the results locally. And I want to be clear at this point, this is not an analysis that HUD requires, but it may help you identify where the problems and opportunities within your system lie so that you can drive improvement from one year to the next. So let's take a look at some scenarios. First, let's look at where people who returned are exiting from. We see in this example that a lot of people who are exiting from a particular safe haven project to permanent housing destinations are subsequently returning to homelessness. That might tell us that we should look at how this safe haven is placing people and see if there are areas we might improve. It could also be that this project is serving a population with major challenges to housing stability and that their rate of return is in line with other projects serving a similar population. It's up to each community locally to discuss the information, decide if the results are appropriate for those being served, or whether the results can be improved. So let's look at a second way you can analyze your local data. So you can also look at the permanent housing destinations that people are exiting to. In our example, notice that a lot of the people who are returning to homelessness originally had exited to housing with family and friends. That could indicate, for example, that more follow-up services are needed to make those housing placements work. These examples only scratch the surface of what you can learn by looking at your data, and it's very easy to get overwhelmed, but don't worry, your analysis does not have to be perfect. But please just get started so you can use the information you've been collecting to improve the outcomes of those experiencing homelessness in your community. So that was measure 2, returns to homelessness, and next up is measure 3, number of homeless people.